The room spun like a carnival ride gone wrong. I clutched the kitchen counter, my knuckles white as the familiar dizziness threatened to overwhelm me. Not again, not now. "Scott?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, heavy footsteps from upstairs. My husband appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of irritation rather than concern. "What is it now, Lena?" he sighed, not moving to help me. I swallowed hard, fighting the nausea. "I think I'm going to faint. Can you just help me to the couch?" Scott rolled his eyes, but crossed the room, roughly grabbing my arm. "This is getting old, you know. Have you even been to the doctor like I told you to?" As he half dragged me to the living room, I bit back a retort. Of course I had been to the doctor, multiple times, but no one could figure out what was wrong with me. The dizziness, the fatigue, the unexplained pain, it was all a mystery. He dumped me unceremoniously onto the couch and stood there, arms crossed. "I have a meeting in an hour. Are you going to be okay? Or do I need to cancel?" I looked up at him, searching for any hint of the man I'd married 10 years ago. The Scott who would have dropped everything to take care of me. The Scott who loved me. "I'll be fine," I lied, closing my eyes against another wave of dizziness. "Go to your meeting." "Great," he said, already turning away. "There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you get hungry later." As the front door slammed behind him, I let out a shaky breath. When had things gotten so bad between us? I thought back to our early days. The romantic gestures, the laughter, the way he'd look at me like I was the only woman in the world. Now, I was lucky if he looked at me at all. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. With shaking hands, I reached for it, hoping it wasn't work calling to ask why I hadn't shown up yet. It was a text from my father-in-law, Frank. "Hey, sweetie, just checking in. How are you feeling today?" I smiled weakly. At least someone cared. "Not great," I typed back. "Another dizzy spell. Scott's gone to a meeting." Frank's response was almost immediate. "Want me to come over? I can bring soup." Tears pricked at my eyes. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." As I waited for Frank to arrive, I couldn't help but wonder what Scott's mother, Beth, would think if she could see us now. She had been so warm, so loving, the complete opposite of her son. Her death 5 years ago had hit us all hard, but sometimes I felt like I was the only one who still mourned her. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. "It's open, Frank," I called out. He entered, a thermos of soup in one hand and a concerned smile on his face. "Oh, Lena," he said, taking in my pale complexion. "You look awful, sweetheart." "Thanks," I said dryly, managing a weak laugh. As Frank busied himself in the kitchen, heating up the soup, I closed my eyes again. The dizziness was subsiding, but a nagging thought remained. Why hadn't Scott told his father he was going to a meeting? And why did Frank seem surprised to find me alone? "Here we go," Frank said, returning with a steaming bowl. "Chicken noodle, Beth's recipe. It'll fix you right up." I took a small sip, savoring the familiar taste. "Frank," I said hesitantly, "did Scott tell you he had a meeting today?" Frank's brow furrowed. "No, he didn't mention anything." "Why?" I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing unease. "No reason. I'm sure he just forgot." But as I ate my soup, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong, and for the first time I allowed myself to wonder. What if my illness wasn't the only thing threatening to tear my marriage apart? The next morning I woke to an empty bed and a pounding headache. Scott's side hadn't been slept in. Again. I reached for my phone, squinting at the bright screen. No messages, no missed calls, nothing. I dragged myself out of bed, ignoring the wave of dizziness that threatened to send me back down. As I made my way to the kitchen, I heard the front door open. "Scott?" I called out. He appeared in the doorway, looking disheveled and smelling faintly of alcohol. "Oh, you're up," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Work thing," he mumbled, heading for the stairs. "Crashed at Dave's. Going to shower." Before I could respond, he was gone. I stood there, my hands shaking as I gripped the kitchen counter. Work thing? On a Tuesday night? And since when did he stay at Dave's without letting me know? The lies were piling up, each one more transparent than the last. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was very wrong with my marriage. I pulled out my laptop, determination overriding my physical discomfort. If Scott wasn't going to be honest with me, I'd find the truth myself. Hours passed as I combed through our joint bank statements, Scott's email, he'd never been good with passwords, and his social media accounts. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I noticed a pattern. Every other Friday, there was a charge at a high-end restaurant downtown. A restaurant Scott had never mentioned going to, and always for two. My heart raced as I dug deeper. There were Uber receipts to and from an unfamiliar address. Hotel charges in cities where Scott claimed to be at conferences. And buried in his email drafts, I found messages to someone named Maggie. Intimate messages, loving messages, messages that should have been for me. I was so engrossed in my discovery that I didn't hear Scott come back downstairs. His voice made me jump. "What are you doing?" I slammed the laptop shut, my cheeks burning with a mix of shame and anger. "Nothing," I lied, hating how easily it came. "Just work stuff." Scott's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push it. "I'm heading out again. Don't wait up." As he turned to leave, something inside me snapped. "Are you seeing someone else?" The words hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. Scott froze, his hand on the doorknob. "What?" he said, his voice dangerously low. I stood up, ignoring the trembling in my legs. "You heard me. Are you cheating on me, Scott?" He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of anger and... "Was that guilt? You're being ridiculous, Lena. Is this because of your... condition? Are you not thinking straight?" The casual dismissal of my illness stung, but I pressed on. "Don't turn this around on me. Answer the question." Scott's jaw clenched. "I don't have time for this. I have a life outside of babysitting you, you know?" "Babysitting me?" I echoed, incredulous. "Is that what you think our marriage is?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "Look, I can't do this right now. We'll talk later." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my suspicions and a growing sense of dread. I sank back up onto the couch, my mind reeling. Scott hadn't denied it. He hadn't even tried to reassure me. And his reaction, it was all the confirmation I needed. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Frank. "Hey, sweetie, just checking in. Scott mentioned you weren't feeling well. Need anything?" I stared at the message, a plan forming in my mind. If Scott was going to lie to me, two could play at that game. "Actually," I typed back, my fingers shaking slightly, "I could use some company, and maybe some advice." As I hit send, I knew there was no going back. Whatever happened next, my life and my marriage would never be the same. Frank arrived within the hour, his kind face etched with concern. I hadn't realized how desperately I needed a friendly presence until I saw him standing in my doorway. "Lena, sweetheart," he said, enveloping me in a warm hug. "What's going on?" I led him to the living room, my hands shaking as I poured us both a cup of tea. "Frank, I think Scott's cheating on me." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Frank's face went through a range of emotions, shock, disbelief, and then a slow, simmering anger. "What makes you think that?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. I told him everything, the late nights, the mysterious charges, the emails to Maggie. With each revelation, Frank's expression darkened. "I can't believe it," he muttered, shaking his head. "Scott, my own son." "There's more," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard him on the phone yesterday. He's planning a trip to the Pacific Islands. With you and Carol." Frank's brow furrowed. "What? We're not planning any trip." The realization hit us both at the same time. Scott was using his parents as a cover for a romantic getaway with his mistress. "Oh, Lena," Frank said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." I nodded, fighting back tears. "What do I do, Frank? I feel so lost." Before he could answer, the front door opened. Scott walked in, stopping short when he saw us. "Dad," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Frank stood up, his normally gentle demeanor replaced by something harder. "I think we need to have a talk, son." Scott's eyes darted between us, realization dawning. "Lena," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What have you been saying?" I stood up, my legs shaky, but my resolve firm. "Only the truth, Scott, something you seem to have forgotten how to tell." "You don't know what you're talking about," Scott snapped. "Dad, whatever she's told you." "Is it true?" Frank interrupted. "Are you having an affair?" The silence that followed was deafening. Scott's face went through a range of emotions, anger, guilt, defiance. "It's complicated," he finally said. Frank's disappointment was palpable. "I raised you better than this, Scott." "You don't understand," Scott argued. "Lena's always sick, always needing something. I can't live like this anymore." His words cut through me like a knife. I stumbled back, gripping the couch for support. "If that's how you feel," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "then maybe we shouldn't be married anymore." Scott's eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me," I continued, a strange calm settling over me. "I want a divorce." The room fell silent. Frank looked between us, his face a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I think that might be for the best," he said quietly. "Scott, I think you should leave. Now." For a moment I thought Scott might argue. But then his shoulders slumped in defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door. As soon as it closed behind him, my legs gave out. I sank onto the couch, my whole body shaking. "Oh, sweetheart," Frank said, sitting next to me and pulling me into a hug. "It's going to be okay. We'll get through this." I nodded against his shoulder, too overwhelmed to speak. As the reality of what had just happened washed over me, a strange mix of grief and relief flooded through me. My marriage was over. The life I had built with Scott was crumbling around me. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. As Frank held me, murmuring words of comfort, I made a silent vow to myself. No matter what happened next, I would survive this. I would rebuild my life, stronger and happier than before. And Scott, well, he would soon learn that actions have consequences, and I had a feeling his were just beginning. The days following my confrontation with Scott blurred together in a haze of grief and determination. I'd moved into the spare bedroom, our interactions limited to tense, monosyllabic exchanges. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. With shaking hands, I logged into Scott's email account again. I knew it was wrong, but I needed answers. I needed proof. And there it was, staring me in the face. An email confirmation for 2 round-trip tickets to Bora Bora. Not in Scott's name, but in the name of his parents. My heart pounded as I read the dates. They matched perfectly with the business trip Scott had mentioned last week. I dug deeper, my stomach churning with each new discovery. There were dozens of emails between Scott and someone named Maggie. Sweet nothings, plans for their future, complaints about me. It was all there, laid bare in black and white. But it was the photos that broke me. Scott and a beautiful blonde woman wrapped in each other's arms on various beaches, in hotel rooms, at romantic restaurants. The timestamps showed a relationship spanning months, maybe even years. I barely made it to the bathroom before I was violently ill. Hours later, I sat on the cold tile floor, my back against the bathtub, when I heard the front door open. "Lena?" Scott called out. "Are you home?" I didn't answer. I couldn't find my voice. His footsteps approached the bathroom. "Lena, are you okay?" The concern in his voice made me want to scream. How dare he pretend to care now? I looked up as he appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of me. "Jesus, Lena, what happened?" "Maggie happened," I said, my voice hoarse. "Bora Bora happened. Your entire double life happened, Scott." The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. Just don't. I've seen everything. The emails, the photos, the trip you booked under your parents' names. It's over, Scott. No more lies." He slumped against the doorframe, defeat written across his features. "Lena, Save it," I interrupted, forcing myself to stand. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I want you out. Now." Scott's expression hardened. "You can't just kick me out. This is my house, too." "Is it?" I countered, a surge of anger giving me strength. "Because from what I've seen, you've been living a whole other life with Maggie. So go live it, but not here." He stepped towards me, his voice low and dangerous. "You're making a big mistake, Lena. You're sick. You need me." I stood my ground, even as my legs threatened to give out. "No, Scott. The biggest mistake I ever made was marrying you, and I'm not as helpless as you think." We stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Scott turned away. "Fine," he spat. "I'll go. But this isn't over." I watched as he stormed out, listening to the sounds of drawers being yanked open and clothes being thrown into bags. When the front door slammed shut, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Trembling, I made my way to the living room and picked up my phone. I had decisions to make, and I couldn't do it alone. "Frank?" I said when he answered. "I need your help. It's worse than we thought." As I filled Frank in on everything I'd discovered, a strange calm settled over me. The worst had happened. My marriage was over, my trust shattered. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of something I'd almost forgotten: hope. Whatever came next, I would face it head on. Scott and Maggie could have their fantasy life in Bora Bora. I was about to start a new chapter of my own, one where I called the shots. And God help anyone who tried to stand in my way. The shrill ring of my phone jolted me awake. I fumbled for it in the darkness, my heart racing. Late-night calls were never good news. "Hello?" I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Lena?" It was Frank, and he sounded devastated. "It's Beth. She's gone." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Beth, my mother-in-law, the woman who had been more of a mother to me than my own, was dead. I struggled to breathe, to comprehend. "What happened?" I managed to choke out. "Heart attack," Frank said, his voice breaking. "It was so sudden. We were just having dinner and—" I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. "I'll be right there, Frank. Just hold on." As I hung up, I realized with a start that Scott wasn't home. Of course he wasn't. He was probably with Maggie, blissfully unaware that his mother had just died. I dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I dialed Scott's number. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice trembling. "Scott, it's your mother. She's gone. Call me back immediately." The drive to Frank and Beth's house was a blur. When I arrived, the sight of the ambulance in the driveway made it all too real. Frank was sitting on the porch steps, looking lost and broken. I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around his shaking form. "Oh, Frank, I'm so sorry." He clung to me like a lifeline. "She was fine, Lena. We were laughing about something on TV and then she just collapsed." Over the next few hours, I handled everything. I spoke with the paramedics, called the funeral home, and tried Scott's phone countless times. Each unanswered call fueled a growing rage inside me. As dawn broke, I was sitting with Frank at the kitchen table, both of us clutching mugs of cold coffee, when my phone finally rang. It was Scott. "Lena? What's going on? I just got your messages." The casual tone of his voice made my blood boil. "Where the hell have you been?" I hissed, stepping outside so Frank wouldn't hear. "Your mother is dead, Scott. Dead, and you've been unreachable for hours." There was a long pause. "What? No, that can't be right." "It is right," I snapped. "She had a heart attack last night. Your father has been devastated, and I've been here alone, handling everything. Where are you?" I'm out of town," he stammered. "On business. I told you." "Save it," I interrupted. "I know exactly where you are and who you're with. But right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is that you get your ass back here immediately. Your father needs you." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with anger and grief. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of funeral arrangements and condolence calls. Scott returned, looking sheepish and guilty, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Not yet. Beth deserved better than that. The morning of the funeral dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the somber mood. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my black dress, a wave of determination washed over me. Beth had always encouraged me to stand up for myself, to be strong. She wouldn't have wanted me to live like this, in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. I looked at my reflection, really looked, for the first time in years. The woman staring back at me was tired, yes, but there was a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. In that moment, I made a decision. After the funeral, after we'd paid our respects to Beth, I would confront Scott. I would expose his lies, not just to him, but to everyone. It was time for the truth to come out. And I was ready to be the one to tell it. With one last deep breath, I turned away from the mirror and headed downstairs. I had a funeral to attend, a husband to confront, and a life to reclaim. Beth would have been proud. The church was packed, a sea of black-clad mourners paying their respects to Beth. I stood at the front next to Frank, my hand on his trembling shoulder. Scott was conspicuously absent. Just as the minister began to speak, the church doors burst open. Scott stumbled in, his suit rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. The congregation turned to stare as he made his way down the aisle. "Sorry I'm late," he mumbled, sliding into the pew next to me. The smell of alcohol on his breath made me recoil. Frank leaned over, his voice a harsh whisper. "Where the hell have you been?" Scott ignored him, his gaze fixed straight ahead. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time or place. But as the service continued, my resolve began to crumble. When it came time for Scott to deliver the eulogy, he stumbled to the podium. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't embarrass himself or dishonor Beth's memory. "My mother," he began, his words slurring slightly, "was a saint. She put up with so much from all of us, especially me. I saw Frank stiffen beside me. Scott continued, his voice growing louder. She always told me to be honest, to face my mistakes, so that's what I'm going to do now. My heart raced. Surely he wouldn't. I've been lying to everyone, Scott announced, his eyes wild. To my wife, to my father, to all of you, I've been having an affair? A collective gasp rippled through the church. Frank grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. Her name is Maggie, Scott continued, oblivious to the shock around him. And I love her. I'm sorry, Lena. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Mom. He stumbled back from the podium, nearly falling. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I stood up, my voice ringing out clear and strong. No, Scott, you don't get to do this. Not here. Not now. All eyes turned to me as I made my way to the front of the church. My legs were shaking, but my resolve was iron. Beth was a wonderful woman, I began, looking out at the stunned faces. She taught me about strength, about dignity, about standing up for myself. And that's what I'm doing now. I turned to face Scott, who was staring at me with a mixture of shock and fear. I've known about your affair for weeks, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I've seen the emails, the photos, the trip you planned to Bora Bora under your parents' names. While Beth was dying, while I was planning her funeral, you were with her. The church was dead silent. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, but I didn't care. Beth deserved better than this, I continued. She deserved a son who honored her, who lived up to the values she taught, and I deserve better too. I turned back to the congregation, my chin held high. I'm sorry you all had to witness this. Beth would have hated the drama, but she also would have wanted the truth to come out. So here it is. My marriage is over, and I'm finally okay with that. With those words, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I walked back to my seat, ignoring Scott's attempts to grab my arm. Frank stood up, his face a mask of fury. Get out, he said to Scott, his voice low and dangerous. Now. As Scott stumbled out of the church, leaving a wake of whispers behind him, I sat there, my heart pounding. I'd done it. I'd finally stood up for myself, for Beth, for the truth. The rest of the service passed in a blur. As we filed out of the church afterwards, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Frank. Beth would have been proud of you, he said, his eyes glistening with tears. I know I am. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As we walked out into the sunlight, I realized that this wasn't just the end of Beth's life. It was the end of my old life, too. And for the first time in years, I was ready to see what the future held. The weeks following Beth's funeral were a whirlwind of legal meetings, hushed phone calls, and sidelong glances from neighbors. I'd become the talk of the town, but for once, I didn't care. I was too busy reclaiming my life. I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the divorce papers. The door burst open, and Scott stormed in, his face flushed with anger. You can't do this to me, Lena, he snarled. You're ruining everything. I met his gaze steadily. No, Scott, you did that all on your own. My lawyer, a stern woman named Patricia, stood up. Mr. Thompson, you weren't invited to this meeting. I'll have to ask you to leave. Scott ignored her, his eyes wild. I've lost my job because of you. The firm says I'm a liability now. Do you have any idea what you've done? A twinge of satisfaction coursed through me. Actions have consequences, Scott. You made your choices. He slammed his fist on the desk, making me flinch. You vindictive bitch. You've turned everyone against me. Even my own father won't speak to me. Patricia reached for the phone. I'm calling security. Don't bother, I said, standing up. I'm leaving. We're done here anyway. As I walked out, Scott grabbed my arm. This isn't over, Lena. You'll regret this. I yanked my arm away, my voice low and dangerous. Touch me again, and you'll regret it. We're through, Scott. Accept it and move on. I left him standing there, shaking with rage. As I drove home, my phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends and family, all expressing their support. But one message made me pause. It was from Maggie. We need to talk. Meet me at the park, 3 p.m. My heart raced. What could she possibly want? Against my better judgment, I found myself driving to the park at the appointed time. Maggie was sitting on a bench, her perfect blonde hair windswept, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked up as I approached. Lena, she said, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry for everything. I sat down beside her, keeping my distance. Why did you want to meet? She took a deep breath. Scott? He's not who we thought he was. He's been lying to both of us. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? He never intended to leave you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was just using me, and now I'm pregnant. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the bench, trying to steady myself. Does he know? I managed to ask. Maggie nodded, tears streaming down her face. He told me to get rid of it, said it would ruin everything. When I refused, he threatened me. A cold fury washed over me. That bastard, I hissed. I didn't know where else to turn, Maggie said, her voice breaking. You're the only one who understands what he's really like. In that moment, looking at this broken woman who had once been my rival, I made a decision that would change everything. Listen to me, Maggie, I said, taking her hand. We're going to get through this, together. Her eyes widened in surprise. You'd help me? After everything? I nodded, a grim smile on my face. Scott hurt us both. It's time we fought back. As we sat there, two unlikely allies united against a common enemy, I felt a surge of determination. Scott thought he could manipulate and threaten his way out of this mess. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I pulled out my phone, dialing a familiar number. Frank, it's Lena. We need to talk. It's about Scott, and it's worse than we thought. As I hung up, I turned to Maggie. Are you ready for this? She nodded, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Let's take him down. In that moment, I knew we were on the brink of something big. The final battle was about to begin, and this time, I wasn't going to lose. 5 years. It's been 5 years since that day in the park with Maggie. 5 years since we decided to take a stand against Scott. And what a journey it's been. I sit on my porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset. The sound of laughter drifts from inside the house, Jake playing with Maggie's daughter, Emma. It's a sound that never fails to warm my heart. The doorbell rings, and I know who it is before I even answer. Frank, his hair now completely gray, but his eyes as kind as ever, stands on the doorstep with a bouquet of flowers. Happy birthday, Lena, he says, pulling me into a hug. As we settle in the living room, Jake joins us, Emma perched on his hip. The sight of them together still amazes me sometimes. After everything that happened with Scott, I never thought I'd trust again, let alone find love. But Jake, he's different. He understands my health struggles, supports me through the bad days, and celebrates the good ones. So, Frank says, a mischievous glint in his eye, have you heard the latest about Scott? I shake my head. After the dust settled from our legal battle, where Maggie and I exposed not just his infidelity, but his financial fraud and threats, I'd made a point of not keeping tabs on my ex-husband. Apparently, he's working as a night janitor at his old firm, Frank chuckles. Quite a fall from grace for the former hotshot lawyer. Part of me wants to feel satisfied to revel in Scott's downfall, but mostly I just feel nothing. The anger, the hurt, the desire for revenge, it's all faded away, replaced by a peace I never thought I'd find. You know, I say, bouncing Emma on my knee, I almost feel sorry for him. Jake raises an eyebrow. Really? After everything he put you through? I nod slowly. Don't get me wrong, he deserves the consequences of his actions, but living with that much bitterness and regret, it must be exhausting. Frank reaches out and squeezes my hand. Beth would be so proud of you, Lena. You've grown so much. His words bring tears to my eyes. Beth had always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I like to think she's watching over us, smiling at the family we've created. As the evening wears on, filled with laughter and love, I find myself reflecting on the journey that brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the fight to reclaim my life, it all led to this moment. Later, as Jake and I get ready for bed, he wraps his arms around me from behind, meeting my eyes in the mirror. You okay? He asks softly. You seemed lost in thought earlier. I turn in his arms, resting my head on his chest. I was just thinking about how far I've come, how different my life is now. He kisses the top of my head. You're the strongest person I know, Lena. You took a horrible situation and turned it into something beautiful. As we climb into bed, I feel a sense of contentment wash over me. My health may still have its ups and downs, but I'm no longer defined by my illness or by what Scott did to me. I'm defined by my resilience, by the love I give and receive, by the family I've chosen. I think about Maggie and Emma, living in their own apartment nearby, building a life free from Scott's shadow. I think about Frank, who became more of a father to me than ever before. And I think about Jake, who loves me unconditionally, who sees my strength even on my weakest days. As I drift off to sleep, I realize something profound. The revenge I once craved, the justice I fought so hard for, it wasn't about making Scott suffer. It was about reclaiming my own power, about proving to myself that I could overcome anything. And I did. I survived. I thrived. And now, surrounded by love and peace, I can finally say I won, not because Scott lost, but because I found myself. And that, more than anything, is the sweetest victory of all.